So, Don, it's a
Okay.
pleasure managing to speak to you. And I love these kind of conversations. My old coach, Brendan Ingle, and mentor, that's one thing I missed out the most out of him, is talking the history of our sport in any aspect. And we spoke briefly prior to this, and you gave me a great insight, your insight to boxing. We're going to start on the colour bar in boxing and the history of it. Where could you start? Where would you start from?
Well, boxing, of course, we know goes back until the late 17th century, and then goes all through the 18th and into the 19th, and then of course we progress to where we are today, 20th and 21st century. It's interesting because the less legitimate boxing was early, bare knuckles were basically a London prize, were basically illegal activity. You had a lot of black fights. Tom Moynihan, there was a fighter, Bill Richmond, could fight and challenge for the bare knuckle title, and people didn't seem to care because we were all outlaws together. As it got more legitimate, more legalized, and reflected the greater society, like the mainstream people in society, there seemed to be more and more prejudice come up, whereas more of a reflection of how people lived, the normal people lived their regular lives, which is a bit of a contradiction, but it's a paradox, and unfortunately, that's how it turned out for many years.
That's kind of the way with most sport, isn't it? The sport is for the working man, and then eventually when it gets to a certain level and money gets involved, the money takes over. It's ringside. The working man probably can't afford to get ringside, never mind be involved in it. It's a working man that's actually taking part in it. So of course, probably the more famous of all black fights or fights of colour is Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson chased for that world heavyweight diamond. Tell us a bit of the backstory to that.
Well, Jack Johnson, obviously, now he came into an era, I mean, we talk about modern boxing, it probably started 1892 in terms of the sport with Sullivan and Corbett, the first heavyweight title fight to a finish that was under Queensberry rules, okay, with gloves, even though they were 2-ounce gloves. And in 1896 in New York, they instituted the Horton Law, which legalized boxing for the first time. Well, 1892, New Orleans, New York really put a rules and constitution together legalizing boxing. And of course you had it in Britain legalized with the National Sporting Club and the Pelican Club. So about the early 1890s, we start to legalize boxing. So you have many, many more people coming in because you could make a living out of it. Although some states in the US, it's still illegal. And Johnson arose in a group of fighters. He was the first, well, Peter Jackson sort of led the way. He was a transitional fighter between bare knuckles and the gloved era and the modern boxing post 1896. But Johnson came up, he, Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, and Sam Langford were great rivals. Harry Wills came a little bit later, but those were the four great rivals at the beginning who were, great black heavyweight fighters that drew attention and had tremendous ability, all Hall of Famers. And Johnson, I guess, was the leader of the pack. He fought all of them. He had victories over the other three, and he really started to make an impact on boxing overall, white boxing, black boxing, just boxing in general. So it was really a great start.
What made him stand out amongst the four? What was it? Was it character? Was it ability? What was it?
Well, in terms of he and Langford, there's a myth that he and Langford fought and Langford beat him and Johnson would never box him again. The reality was he fought Langford in Chelsea, Massachusetts, where Langford was from. He decked Langford in the fight and won a 15-round clear decision. But Sam Langford, to his credit, was only 159 pounds to Jack Johnson, 188 pounds. So it was 3-division difference in the guys. There were only a few divisions in those days, but 30 pounds basically in weight. So it was a different division. So he was a larger man than Langford, just physically and naturally. In terms of Jeanette and McVeigh was a great puncher, but didn't have the science. Jeanette was a great boxer, but didn't have the punch. And Johnson just seemed to combine it both. He was a fighter that combined ring skill and power. He was a great counter puncher. He fought off the ropes. He was a guy who initiated certain things that hadn't been seen in boxing. And, when you, John, as a fighter yourself, when you do something different, it takes everybody else, the rest of the pack, to catch up. So when you're an innovator, like he was, like Dempsey, like Lewis, like Ali, you're going to lead that for a while to everybody else says, hey, that's a style I can adapt to. So he was just a new kind of guy who combined power punching with boxing, with the skill of avoiding punches, with parrying punches. And he was the entire package. And he was a big man physically.
He was clearly years ahead of his time, but it wasn't just his actions inside the ropes that probably we still refer to now. We still measure fighters of yesteryear, I'm talking like your Orleans and even before your Orleans or after your Orleans. It was these antics outside the ropes that really differentiated that where colour could become an issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Remember, he was from Galveston, as a Texas. That's the South. So in the South in those days, you ostensibly in the U.S. had an apartheid system, where in the South, there was a famous Supreme Court ruling in the 50s, two societies, one black, one white, separate but unequal. And even after the Civil War, there was liberation of slavery, but the black people in the South still lived under certain laws that were adopted called Jim Crow era, where they didn't have equal rights at all, So there was a separation. But boxing was very unique because we accepted anybody, as I said before. We integrated sport far before any of the other organized sports like football or American baseball, where you had George Dixon, a world champion in the 1880s, and he was black. You had Joe Gans, who preceded Johnson as a world champ. You had Joe Walcott, the welterweight champ. So sportsmen didn't really care. If you were the best fighter, they wanted to see you, and it was regardless of your race or ethnicity. The big ethnicity supported boxing: Jewish, the Irish, and the Italians here. So it was an outlet for people who couldn't get an opportunity to make big money in any other field. And Johnson was accepted. I think as he got more famous, more access to more money, his behavior was different, and he was really a libertine. He was a guy, a real hedonist. It wasn't that he was making any kind of political decisions. He's going to live his life. If he went with white women in the South, which is like, sacrilege to them, he didn't really care. I think he put his own personal regard above anything else and just sort of shrugged it off and said, "This is me, take it or leave it."
And it was pretty much a political statement he probably didn't realize he was making at the time as well. And there's one thing that kind of stands out that you said to me: our sport is probably one of the most inclusive sports, if not the most inclusive sport out there. Because even if you're trying to say a guy can't box the title if he's black or white, a winner is a winner. And so regardless of what he said on paper, it's the best has to prove he's the best. So the common man will think, well, yeah, I know that, but the best has to fight the best. And that's what makes our sport different from any other sport.
Absolutely. Even going beyond race, ethnicity, and nationality, we're the only sport where someone would be 105 pounds. What is that? About 12 stone, and compete for a championship and maybe make millions of dollars. You couldn't come in at that. A 5-foot person could not go in to football and make a living. He just would be, the guys are just too big, too strong. It's just physically impossible. But we have a niche for every weight, from, the smallest person to somebody who weighs 300 pounds. So we're the most Catholic and inclusive in every aspect of sport and in society. We give more opportunities to more people than any other sport, but we're always vilified. You know that, John? Demonized.
But you look at the likes of Jack Johnson, and you see he inspired fighters like Ali. He inspired fighters like, he's the root of that inspiration for fighters like Ali. The root of that inspiration for fighters like Sonny Liston before Ali. The root of fighters today like Deontay Wilder, getting in there with a chip on his shoulder, and that. So even without realizing it, he was saying things that black people just was too scared to say at that time.
No, absolutely. Look, the fact that he was a black man when the one in that time was in 1908 when he was champs, the biggest diadem in sports. You were a legitimately world champion that everywhere in the world recognized you, not just in American baseball or English football or a sport, in an obscure sport to us, an Asian sport. You were everyone would recognize you. Your picture would be in an illustrated magazine or newspaper, any place on the planet, from Australia to the US to England to Japan. You were something. And he gave inspiration to not only, blacks in America, but the entire world, and people of, non-Caucasians, Asian people say, hey, this guy can do it. And he was world recognized. So it was an amazing achievement, forgetting about his own personal attitude or his personality, just the fact that he did it, that you could achieve the highest diadem in sports, irrespective of race, was an incredible inspiration to athletes in every sport.
And you'd look at the other side of the spectrum, you'd look at someone like Joe Louis. Joe Louis didn't want to be loud, bombastic, braggadocious. He wanted to be quiet, non-offensive, non-political. And he was quite the opposite to Jack Johnson. And is that because what was happening politically around the time outside the ring for him to be like that?
I think a lot. I mean, people don't realize the impact that Johnson had. You know, they say you have two ways to react to things: it's fight or flee. Now we know that Johnson, there was a lot of racial abuse, but if you look in the early career, almost all the sports, and again, I say the fans supported Johnson because they said it's fair. He's the best fighter. He should get his chance. Tommy Burns was the champ, not a great champ. He fought a lot of inferior fighters, although he's very active. He had, I think, 13 title defenses, a great deal for that time. And, you know, they were writing, Burns, you have to fight Johnson. Burns, you have to fight Johnson. So they did back him. When he fought Burns eventually for the title, they drew 30,000 people in Australia, unprecedented. And this because they supported Johnson as a great fighter who had fought twice in Australia there before to establish himself and to get himself familiarized with the crowd and maybe get, you know, home base that was rooting for him as a sportsman, as an athlete, not as a person of any race or a different race. But when Johnson, you know, he was, again, bombastic. He got involved with the Mann Act, and that was questioning his morality. Now, whether it was trumped up or not, we do know that he went with prostitutes. We do know that he went with women of, you know, whether questionable sexual or well, not orientation, but willingness to go with whatever and any time. So, yeah. So he was not a model for young kids growing up. So this is the guy you want to be. Well, maybe they wanted to be like him because he had every kind of vice that they wanted and enjoyed. But he, you know, he didn't downplay it. And then when the racial thing came in, started attacking him, he didn't just take it. He said, well, I'm going to attack back. I'm going to show you. I'm going to, you know, humiliate these opponents. And maybe that wasn't in his heart because he was a very well-liked person. People I know who have met him, he's a wonderful guy. Everybody liked him. He was not a vicious. There was no, you know, meanness to the man. He's just doing this, as you say, like a braggadocio, like putting on the show. But in those times, in 1900s, very, very difficult, especially in the South where you could go to prison if you married somebody outside your race. I think the reaction to that Jeffries fight was so bad because they banned the interstate transportation of fight films. It affected the industry and affected many fights, like you say, the color bar. After that fight, Johnson did defend against a black man in France. It was a draw, but no other black fighter got a chance, particularly Harry Wills with Dempsey. And they told us just low key it, you know, just don't say anything. People would say it was Uncle Tom. But I believe that if Johnson had that attitude and said, I'll swallow it, I don't think there would have been a problem with black heavyweights fighting for the world title after that. I mean, he would have had to eat some crow, but also he did overinflame the situation too. You know, I think he said, I'll take it, I'll just do whatever I want. And I think he had a greater obligation, you know, to say, I got to low key it.
People like him and people like are the ones that create history in our sport. It got to the point where Johnson was, you know, he was a bullfighter in Spain. He even came to England, you know, performing in the flags. People don't know that side, that depth of what this man had to go to from what he was running from to create a living and to what he ran to. And it's not many fighters, if any, have lived that life.
No. I mean, he got convicted of the Mann Act. Well, he was tried. I don't think he was convicted. I think that he was indicted on the Mann Act, which is taking a woman across state lines for interstate for immoral purposes. And by the way, the Mann Act was used against Rudolph Valentino at one point. Charlie Chaplin was nearly going to be charged with the Mann Act. So it wasn't unique to Johnson. It wasn't just because of race.
So don't explain what the Mann Act was.
Well, at the time in the West, when it was developing, this is around the turn of the 20th century, there were this white slavery, it was called, which means women put into prostitution. And a lot of girls, the country was changing. It was going from a rural economy to an urban economy. And it was the first time after about 1910 where more people living in cities than countries. And the idea was these girls, these farmers' daughters, so to speak, these girls from these rural backgrounds were going into the city and they were being abused and used and turned into prostitution. And out west, a lot of Chinese women, a lot of women were being brought out there and brought into brothels. And so this is what it tried to turn down. The girl disappears at night. She leaves home and winds up in a brothel. And this was happening. It was quite amazing. So to try to stem this tide, they brought in a Mann Act as a moral thing. People thought they created the Mann Act just for Jack Johnson. That's totally untrue. It was done because there was a rise in young girls leaving the farm, so to speak, to go to find their future in the city, and then finding out they get exploited and were shipped out to different brothels in the West Coast and things like that, and developing areas where there weren't women. So It was sort of pretty much like when we introduced prohibition in this country to combat, the rise in alcoholism. Kind of we're very puritanical in certain ways in the United States, and this is one of the aspects of it. But they use this obviously to go after Johnson.
Is Johnson the one that stands out to you the most, that did the most for black fighters back in the day?
Well, I think, again, it did the most. There were things that he did. Again, I think the morality, forget about anything else. The morality sort of was a bad kind of a situation. I think he had an obligation again to tone it down, and he didn't. But in terms of inspiration, winning the heavyweight championship of the world, you couldn't inspire anybody any more than that. He was totally inspired that generation of fighters. I mean, Joe Gans to this day is talked of as one of the greatest fighters that ever lived, pound for pound. He's a lightweight champ. He preceded Johnson slightly by a couple of years and died very young, 37. So he was another truly great fighter. And among historians, Sam Langford, there were many, many great fighters emerging in that period of time. And unfortunately, the heavyweights suffered because they didn't get the chance. But other fighters were getting the opportunity. As I said, until about 1920, when we became legalized and you found black fighters struggling a bit more to get their opportunity for the world title. They were getting fights, but for the world title, it was getting to be very difficult.
Don, this is in theory of the first $1 million gate against with two white fighters. Tell us the history.
Well, I have to say this: two white fighters, the first $1 million gate, but the biggest gate up until that time in boxing was Johnson and Jeffries, a black and a white fighter. Because of the reputation of Jeffries being so great and Johnson being so great, so they surpassed this. This is the most significant fight in the history of the business of boxing, I believe. They went from drawing, I think, the Johnson-Jeffries fight to about 16,000. Now you're drawing 90,000 people within 5 miles of New York City. And there's a story to that. It just revolutionized everything. It was the first major sporting event to be broadcast on radio. Radio sales increased 1,000%. People buying what they call crystal sets just to hear this fight outside of the area. The film sales were absolutely incredible. There was totally unprecedented. They were renting out barges to go from New York City across the Hudson River at $5 a person. And they came in, ships actually taking them just a 5-mile distance to see this fight. There was no bridge in those days. You had to take ferries. It was an unprecedented event. And when they saw that, you saw almost every major city and country start to legalize boxing. So it was an absolute phenomenon. And again, 100 years ago, Equipe, the famous French newspaper, the daily sports paper in France, ran a front page story on the 2nd of July in commemoration. So you talk about iconic, 100 years after an event to make the front page, that's pretty good.
And also it created the blueprint for now, for the big fights now, what they know boxing can actually achieve, how it can have that crossover appeal. And that was the blueprint. It can actually happen.
Oh, absolutely. And the fact it took place in the shadow of a major city. I mean, New York had legalized boxing a few months before. There's all sorts of political intrigue, how Jersey City got it. They built the stadium just to accommodate the people, but they didn't anticipate 80,000 people getting there. And there's a story in the paper saying there was rioting outside because there weren't enough tickets left. Imagine selling 90,000 seats and not enough tickets to satisfy the crowd. An absolute phenomenon. Changed everything. And Dempsey's style also helped. Yeah.
So you move 40 years forward, and along comes Cassius Marcellus Clay
Right.
in a divided, segregated, fractured America. And maybe time was everything, because his political stance on many platforms was probably one thing that elevated him and made him even bigger and made him a better fighter than what people give credit for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, now, of course, he's recognized probably the greatest heavyweight of all time. But he was, I'll tell you, though, here's the great difference. When he turned pro, there was a group that came to him. They signed him. They paid him a weekly salary. They bought him a car. They gave him $5,000. He's a man who never, talk about struggle. I mean, he was from a nuclear family. He was not like Sonny Liston, one of 18 children on a plantation in the South and had nothing. His father and his mother had 2 children, himself and his brother, who was named after Rudolph Valentino, changed his name to Rahman Ali later. Mm-hmm. He was a child of really, I wouldn't say wealth, but a privilege. He never worked a day in his life, till he got up. He was a well-known amateur on televised shows in Louisville when he was 12, 13, 14 years of age. He went into the National Golden Gloves. He got into the Olympics. He got money and a car and a salary given to him when he came out. He didn't, like Jack Johnson, fight for, $12 when he turned pro and get arrested for fighting Joe Choinsky. So he sort of had a privileged way to go. But yes, there were different times. He wasn't as restricted as Johnson, but he certainly made his cause, well known.
So if his upbringing was so different from Johnson, Sonny Liston, even Joe Fraser,
yeah,
why would he, or how would he become so passionate to have his finger on the pulse of Black America at the time? Because you look at the two of them, you look at, the bad blood between him and Fraser. He actually turned it around, because the things he said about Fraser should have actually been put on himself rather than on Fraser.
It's so interesting with him. I mean, he was so bombastic. Again, I think like Johnson, he was over the top, but he was so well liked that people accepted it. And there was a meanness to him. You remember the Ernie Terrell fights and things like that.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, when you have revolutions in countries. I mean, I was reading about Alexander the II in Russia, and he freed the serfs. And after he freed the serfs, an anarchist blew him up and assassinated him. You would think that'd be the exact opposite, but it wasn't. You've got to have a little bit of freedom in order to express yourself. Otherwise, you're so, if you're so submissive, and if you're so low on the totem pole, and you're so suppressed, you can't express anything. Ali had the freedom to express things, and did. And it's an interesting thing. When he didn't go into the draft in 1967, and the commissions took his title, and within their rules, they could do it, whether you agreed or not, the rules allowed for that. He was stripped of the championship. He was suspended. But by 1970, which was before the Supreme Court ruled in June of 71, he was allowed to box. He got his license back in Georgia. He fought in New York twice, the Bonavina fight and the Frazier fight. So the political attitude had changed a great deal about the war and about racial situations. So it had changed even before he was acquitted eventually by the Supreme Court. So it took its course, but it had to run its political course as well. And he became a darling, obviously, of the left, as well as Black America, and other people felt they were disenfranchised.
Well, looking at boxing today, I think I know the answer. Looking at boxing today, do you see there being any disadvantage to fighters of any color, any creed, any religion?
I really don't. I don't see it. I mean, the wealthiest fighter of all time is Floyd Mayweather. Now, people I see on the internet, they're fans of Mayweather, who, say this and that, and they'll defend him unto death. But I don't think people disagree about him. Nothing to do with race. They might say Robinson's a better fighter, or Henry Armstrong a better fighter, but I never see, somebody else. I know the Mayweather fans, when they see Marciano 49-0 and Floyd 50-0, they're always rousing that Marciano wasn't entitled to that 49-0, and the Marciano fans are saying Floyd was entitled to 50-0. But it's not a discussion about race at all. It's a discussion about ability. So I don't think that counts. Joshua was one of the greatest attractions in the history of British boxing. 60, 70,000 people turning out to see him fight. I think we've really crossed that bar to a great degree, and I think that it's come back to where it was maybe, again, earlier in the 20th century. But, Joe Louis did a lot. I think, again, on ability, if you were a great attraction, you were a colorful fighter in terms of excitement, you were going to draw Kid Chocolate, Henry Armstrong, Joe Louis, Sugar Ray Robinson. People say, oh, he's a black fighter, didn't get a chance. Well, they talk about a famous fighter, Charlie Burley, who was a great middleweight in the 1940s. He didn't get a chance because he didn't draw people. If he drew like Robinson or Lewis, he would have fought. And it was all about the gate in those days. And there were white fighters, Teddy Arrows and Sammy Angot. They got chances at the title. Once they lost the title, they never got a fight again because they were boring fighters. You had to draw people at the gate to get an opportunity. That was Trump. That superseded everything else.
Still the same today.
Yeah, it is today. Absolutely. And if you get television ratings, you get on there. And what makes that exciting fight? John, you went through that. You were a beautiful, great tactician. You weren't Arturo Gatti. You would have beaten Arturo Gatti of the same weight. But it's always been like that. I said, this guy's just winning fights. Yeah, but that's not enough. He's got to get his brains knocked out in order for us to enjoy ourselves. And the public at that point doesn't really care. They want a bullfight, not a chess match.
Unfortunately, show business, and sometimes a business takes over the show. Don, it's been an absolute pleasure talking history with you. I'm looking forward to doing it again.
Thank you very much, John. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.